The Hollywood 10 were a group of left-leaning screenwriters and directors, some of whom, such as John Howard Lawson, were members and or leaders of the U.S. Communist Party, who were called before Congress circa 1947 because there were allegations that they were smuggling in communist propaganda into the films they were writing and or directing. They contended, not without challenge, that it was virtually difficult or virtually impossible to smuggle in communist propaganda, since you had executives at the top of the food chain who had to sign off not only on the scripts, but also on the so-called rushes, that is to say, the filming day to day in terms of movies that were being produced. Actually, what was at play was a conflict between a previous historical epic and an ongoing epic that was initiated circa 1947. What I mean by that is that during the previous historical epic, speaking of World War II, 1941 to 1945, in terms of US participation, the United States was in an alliance with the then Soviet Union against Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Imperial Japan. As a result, you saw that the US President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was encouraging Hollywood to make films that were compatible with this new alliance with Moscow. You can still go to YouTube and witness and view a film such as Mission to Moscow, which portrays a portrait of the then Soviet Union totally at odds with what many people had been taught to believe. That is to say, the leader, Mr. Stalin, was portrayed as benevolent, much beloved by the Russian, Ukrainian, and other Soviet masses. But what happens post-1945, that is to say, with the end of World War II, was the launching of a Red Scare and a Cold War. That is to say, the United States and the Soviet Union became at odds. Many of these screenwriters, such as John Howard Lawson, were leaders of the US Communist Party, which I think it's fair to say had a rather close relationship with Moscow, and they were perceived as a result as being enemies within the gates. To draw an analogy, it would be as if in one of the Rambo films starring Sylvester Stallone, which portrays the religious zealots such as Osama bin Laden as freedom fighters, that was during a time when the United States was supporting the so-called freedom fighters in their conflict with Moscow. It would be as if after the worm turned and the freedom fighters were derided as terrorists, then Sylvester Stallone would be driven into a congressional hearing room and interrogated and lambasted for producing a movie that was glorifying the so-called terrorists, once viewed as freedom fighters. He could argue credibly that when he was producing that particular Rambo film, he was in tune with the zeitgeist in Washington, and he should not be castigated after the zeitgeist changes. That was the anomalous position that the Hollywood 10 were placed in. However, their arguments were not viewed benignly. A number of them wound up being jailed, including John Howard Lawson, including Dalton Trumbo, who carried the reputation as being one of the most talented screenwriters in the history of the industry. Some of you may be familiar with his script for Spartacus, an anti-slavery drama starring Kirk Douglas. John Howard Lawson wrote the script to Sahara, a World War II drama. which has one of the early positive portrayals of a Black person. As he was en route to prison, he was able to pen the script to the first anti-apartheid drama, speaking of Cry the Beloved Country, starring the late Hollywood megastar Sidney Poitier, and also Canada Lee, another Black actor who ran afoul of the so-called blacklist. Speaking of the blacklist, what happens is that these screenwriters and directors like Trumbo and Lawson, who were viewed as all too close to the organized left, found it difficult to find work. There's a movie starring Woody Allen called The Front that depicts what happens when, under the cover of placing a so-called front, or that is to say, some sort of nebbish individual, such as the character Woody Allen plays, they are given credit for writing scripts that are actually written by so-called blacklisted screenwriters. This so-called blacklist lasted for a number of years until, I guess it's fair to say, that it went into remission.